Hi, I'm Justin from Warne, and today we're going to take a moment to talk about some of the details and installation of our shotgun rib mount. So when you think of a shotgun, the first thing that comes to mind probably is not mounting optics to it. But in this day and age, there's a lot of different shotgun shooters that might want an optic for different reasons, either for competitive use or for hunting use, like turkey hunting or waterfowl hunting, or for those shooters who may be cross-eye dominant, so you have a hard time keeping both eyes open when you're shooting. All reasons that you might want to try to use a red dot. Most shotguns out there are not drilled and tapped, meaning they do not have holes in the receiver to be able to mount any kind of base or rail to it. So it makes mounting an optic fairly difficult. So we set out to design a mount that will mount directly to a vented rib on the shotgun barrel that will fit most of your popular Reflex Sight patterns, the hole patterns in the top. And so when you purchase this mount, what you're going to get inside is a small bag with some pins and some screws. These are important. You're going to receive a T15 wrench and the mount that is attached to this small plastic card. To remove it, I'm going to loosen up all these screws and pull it off this plastic card. Okay. So now that I have my mount removed from the packaging, you'll notice that this mount has two clamps. There's 3 screws per side of the clamp, and they do move at a slight angle upward to be able to mount to your rib. On top of the mount, you'll notice that there is an arrow on one side of it. That is the direction you want the mount to face toward the muzzle and toward the barrel of the shotgun. If you mount it the other way, you could have issues with the hole patterns lining up for the optic that you're going to use. When we are choosing to mount this to the vented rib, now this has to be a vented rib. If you have a solid rib on your gun, it will not work. It has to be a vented rib. And I can pick really anywhere on the barrel that I want to mount it to. My personal preference, I want it kind of back toward the chamber area. One thing to keep in mind is where the rib comes down and contacts the barrel, you don't want your clamps over those areas because it's going to interface with that differently than the vented area of the rib. You want to pick one of these sections between for the clamps to go. Installation is pretty straightforward. I'm going to lay it down on top of my rib, making sure that those clamps are in an area where those posts coming down are not going to make any contact. One other thing is the arrow on top. There's another line in the back. You can use those to help make sure that the plate stays centered on your rib as you're tightening both sides. And I'm going to evenly tighten the clamps on both sides. One thing that you want to make sure of, depending on your size of rib and the thickness of the rib, is that the clamps are making contact with the side of the rib. So if you see that when you're installing it, that one of the clamps might fall under your rib and start to work its way under, make sure that it's contacting the sides of that rib in the right position. You'll be able to see it once you start tightening the screws. Again, I'm just going to make sure that I have the arrow and the line in the back properly aligned as I tighten these. I like to tighten the middle screws first, just because it gives me a good idea of when we're starting to get tight. And I'm just going to barely snug those up, and then I'm going to come back to the other 4 corner screws. So now that I have these screws tightened down, I'm just going to take a peek and make sure that those clamps are contacting the sides of those ribs and that the top of the rib mount is sitting flat all the way down on top of the rib. This one is. So I'm going to go ahead and torque these screws. We recommend no more than 18 inch-pounds. And I'm going to start by evenly tightening. It's really important, since you have this centered on your rib, that you evenly tighten these screws a little bit at a time to make sure you don't knock it off one side or the other. Again, right now I'm just doing the middle screws, but we're going to go back and touch all the others. For the remaining screws, I'm just going in an X pattern. And there we go. So the rib mount is now successfully installed on my shotgun barrel. Now when it comes to mounting your optic to the plate itself, you have a lot of different options based on the number of screw holes and pinholes in the top. Again, this fits most of your popular Reflex Sight patterns. In this case, I have two just to reference, but one would be a Trijicon RMR. The other would be any of the what we would call the doctor interface optics. There's a lot of different ones out there by different manufacturers, but we would consider them using that doctor style interface. One note with a Trijicon RMR specifically, not just the RMR pattern, but the RMR, is it is open on the bottom of the optic. And there's a little gasket that goes around where the electronics are. It's important that we don't let any moisture in there, and with the number of holes in the top of our mount, you're going to want to seal this off. We do offer a sealing plate, and this is just a small thin steel shim that can mount to the surface of this mount before you mount an RMR specifically. But today we're going to be mounting a doctor interface. So I'm going to take my baggie of hardware, and I have 2 pins and I have 2 screws. The screws that are provided in this package are specifically to be used with the doctor interface optics. Not all of these optics use the same thread pitch with the screws that come with them. So if you have a doctor interface optic, you are going to want to use the screws that come in the package. For all other types of optics you're going to mount to this plate, you use the factory provided hardware. And we are going to insert our pins. You're going to have different pin locations in the top depending on what type of optic you have. And you can see in the bottom of the optic that there are the holes for where those pins go. The pins have 2 different sides. There's a wider side and a narrower side. They will only drop into these holes one direction, so you'll figure out pretty quick if you have it the correct direction or not. Okay, so I've dropped my pins in the correct holes. I'm going to align my optic so it will sit down on those pins. For the screws that attach the optic to the plate, we do recommend a little dab of blue Loctite on each one of the screws. And then you're going to tighten the screws. For the screws mounting the optic to the plate, you're going to torque it to your optic manufacturer's specification. And as easy as that, I've added an optic to my shotgun. So for that RMR, if you're mounting it to the plate, I have dropped my pins in place. This is an example of how this sealing plate works. The plate will just lay on top between the pins. It only fits on one way. One set of holes lines up for your RMR, and then your optic will mount over the top of the plate and the pins, and your screws will drop in, sealing off the bottom of it. Some of the advantages of this rib mount compared to, say, a more conventional Picatinny rail mounted to the receiver with an optic on top is that with this style, we're actually able to get the optic very low to the shotgun barrel itself, so it's a more natural point when you're pointing the shotgun. With a Picatinny rail, typically you have the optic sitting on a mount, sitting on top of a rail, and then all of that down to basically the rib height of the shotgun. This is a much lower profile mount. We offer this in a couple different fits, one for the low profile reflex style optics. We make one for the Aimpoint ACRO interface as well as the Aimpoint T1-T2 style interface. So that's the installation process of our shotgun rib mount. One note about the reflex style optics or the ACRO or the Aimpoint T1-T2 style, they all clamp on to the rib in the same manner. It's just different interfaces on top of the mount. So head to your local dealer, look for this mount, or head to our website at warnescopemounts.com, and we'll see you next time.